Hello and welcome to another video from Clarion Solicitors' Contentious Private Client team about all things trusts and probate disputes. I'm Lynsey Harrison, and today I'm joined by my colleague Nicholas, who is a solicitor in the team.
Hi, Lynsey.
Hi. So one question that we get asked a lot about is breaches of trust.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about, firstly, what a breach of trust is?
Sure. So essentially, a breach of trust is when someone in a position of power takes advantage of that or basically doesn't follow the rules. Normally, in a trust context, that person is called the trustee. And those breaches of trust, it's a very catch-all word expression. It can mean anything from an intentional breach to an unintentional breach. And it can also be something quite serious or something not so serious. To give you an example, a serious breach, and a rather obvious one, is say the trustee goes off to Las Vegas and gambles away all the trust money and loses it all, or invests in cryptocurrency and loses it all that way. That is a very clear breach of trust and a very obvious one. A perhaps less obvious one would be if that same trustee fails to keep records. That doesn't seem quite so serious, but it can still be a breach of trust.
And would a trustee who does breach to trust face any consequences?
Normally, yes. What would often happen is that the people who are expecting to receive money from the trust, so those people are called beneficiaries, they will often want to hold the trustee accountable. So they might bring a claim against the trustee to get them to make good the mistake. So if the trustee's lost all the money, the beneficiaries might seek for the trustee to pay that back into the trust.
I can see why a beneficiary to a trust would want to take that sort of action, obviously to hold the trustees accountable for what they've done.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know we often act for trust beneficiaries, but we also act for trustees as well, don't we?
Yeah, exactly.
And so in that scenario, what types of discussions do you have with trustees when they're facing claims by beneficiaries? What sort of things come up?
Well, usually the first step when we're speaking to trustees facing claims from beneficiaries is we'll want to do a thorough investigation. So we'll ask lots of questions and really get to the heart of what happened, really try and understand the facts. Once we know the facts, we'll then look at, say, are there any trustee defenses available? Some type of defense you can put up to resist the claim by the beneficiaries.
So what types of things amount to a defense?
You'd actually be surprised. There's a lot of defenses available. The three that come to my mind, the most common ones, would be, first of all, if there's a exoneration clause. The second one would be if there's a time limit, perhaps. And then the third one that's quite common is there any scope for the trustees to have their conduct excused by the judge, by the court?
Yeah. Okay, so let's just break that down a little bit more. So starting with the first one, what is a trustee exoneration clause? Where can a trustee look to see if they have one in their trust?
Yeah. Trustees should start by looking at the legal document that set up the trust. That could be a will. It could also be something called a declaration of trust. There's lots of different types of documents it might be. Once you know what document you're looking at, you want to look for a clause that essentially does one of three things. The first one is it might say, quite simply, that the trustee's liability is excluded altogether. But you might also have a trust which limits the duties of the trustee. And a third type might be actually a clause that extends the powers of the trustee, that lets them do something that normally you can't do under trust law.
And these clauses are legally binding on beneficiaries as well?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay. And the second defense you mentioned is time limits. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So a time limit, essentially most claims for breach of trust have a 6-year deadline. That's actually quite important because it means if the beneficiaries don't bring a claim within that time frame, they might lose the right to bring a claim altogether.
Okay, and what if a trustee hides what they've done? I assume that there are exceptions if something like that has happened.
Yeah, there are exceptions. The most common exception you might encounter is, say, there's been fraud. So in cases of fraud, actually the time limit just goes away altogether. So there's no time limit in that case. But there might be other exceptions as well. Yeah.
And in terms of the final exception, you mentioned that the court can sometimes excuse behaviour. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, in England and Wales, that's under Section 61 of the Trustee Act 1925. And what that act says is if a trustee's behavior has been reasonable and honest, a judge looking at the situation can actually excuse the behavior of the trustee.
So could you give us an example of what that looks like in practice?
Sure. Probably the most well-known case of this type of excusing of conduct is a case that involved a trustee paying the wrong person. And the reason they did that is because they'd misread the trust document, essentially. So that's a very clear breach of trust. You can't pay the wrong person. You have to pay the correct people. You have to pay the beneficiaries. In that case, however, the court looked at all the factors. They saw, well, this person took legal advice, and that was a very important factor. On the basis of that, they actually excused the trustee's behavior, again, emphasizing that they'd taken this legal advice.
That sounds very sensible.
No, it is very sensible. Yeah, I'd say if there was one takeaway from this conversation is that any trustee facing a claim from beneficiaries should take legal advice as soon as possible, and specialist trust advice as well, because you never know what defenses might be available.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful, Nicholas. And as always, if you have any clients or questions yourselves about these types of issues, just get in touch with us here at Clarion. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Lynsey.
Thanks.